It was a silent night, like all the others that followed. Inside the house of large walls and empty hallways, the sound of the clock in the living room seemed more deafening than ever. She knew something was happening, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. When she was just 16, the last photo of her was removed from the family album. Like a blurred and faded memory, her image vanished from every corner of her home. There was no longer a portrait of her on the wall, no longer a mention of her name in Sunday conversations around the dinner table. And when she looked for the last time in the mirror in her home, she saw the reflection of someone who no longer existed. She was disappearing, being erased, not by her actions or choices, but by the decision of a family that saw her as a shadow, a mistake that needed to be forgotten. She didn't know when exactly the fine line between being a daughter and being an outsider had been crossed. Perhaps it was the moment she refused to follow the unspoken rules of a stifling family world. Perhaps it was when she dared to become who she truly was, unconcerned with imposed standards. Or perhaps it was simply the fact that, over the years, she had become something they didn't know how to handle, someone who didn't fit the perfect mold they tried to forge for themselves. At some point, her name was removed from everything. She was no longer in family photos, no longer in everyday conversations. She was replaced by a more acceptable version of the daughter they wanted but could never have. There was something quiet and treacherous about her exclusion. It wasn't a dramatic argument, there were no shouts or accusations, there was no grand goodbye. There was no room for goodbyes in a house that had become a place where love seemed merely a formality, an exchange of empty words. She was erased. With an almost cruel gentleness, as if she had been a shadow of someone who never truly existed. The sister who had once played beside her on summer afternoons was now a stranger, as if she had been programmed to accept the family's decision to no longer speak of her. Her father, a rigid and austere authority figure, now looked at her as if she were a flaw in the tapestry of his perfect life. And her mother, always so devoted, had a distant look in her eyes, as if waiting for her to fade away, to leave quietly. She didn't understand. She never did. It wasn't for lack of effort, it wasn't for lack of trying. Her every gesture, every attempt to reach out to her family, was meticulously ignored. Every smile, every word, seemed like a silent insult to a space she could never inhabit. The years passed, and she found herself sunk in a deep hole, where the pain of abandonment had no sound, but a weight that seemed to crush her from within. She was there, but she wasn't. She was physically present, but her presence was so small, so irrelevant to them, that at some point she herself began to believe it was her fault. And perhaps, if she had done more, if she had fit in more, if she had been more what? Easier to accept? More perfect? More in control? And so, she disappeared. Not physically, but mentally and emotionally. She was left behind as her family moved on, as if she had never existed. Her image was no longer on the walls, no longer in their memories. And she had no choice but to accept what was happening. She kept quiet. She learned to keep her distance, to be invisible, to suffocate under the burden of a pain she never dared share. But inside her, there was a flame that refused to die. A flame that compelled her to move forward, even when everything around her made her doubt her own worth. The emptiness she felt was immense, but it also became a space where she could begin to understand who she truly was. She learned to rebuild herself, to create an identity that didn't depend on anyone else. Not because she wanted to distance herself from her family, but because the pain of being invisible became unbearable. She had to exist for herself, to be something beyond what they had created for her. Each day, she rebuilt herself, even knowing that every piece of her soul was rejected by those she loved most. Life outside the house was hard. There were moments of profound loneliness, discomfort, and hopelessness. But there was something inside her that refused to give in. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she needed to find a place where her story would be valued. Where her identity wouldn't be defined by what others thought of her, but by what she knew to be her truth. She didn't want to be an eternal shadow. She wanted to be seen. Even if that meant disappearing completely. And then, the opportunity appeared. Like a call in the darkness. The Pentagon sought her out, not because she was a rejected daughter, but because she was someone whose skills, intelligence, and ability to act without hesitation were essential to a national security mission. She was called upon to be a key player in a top-secret operation. Something she never imagined would happen, but which seemed, in some ways, a reflection of who she truly was, someone with a purpose far greater than her family had ever recognized. She was no longer ignored or undervalued. She became essential. Finally, she got what she always wanted, recognition, but not from who she expected. It was only when the operation reached its climax, when her story was revealed to the world, that her family saw her again. Not as the lost daughter, not as the invisible girl she once was, but as a woman shaped by adversity, who had found her purpose and her voice. It was when the TV cameras captured her image again that the truth, so uncomfortable for all of them, came to light. They finally realized that while their family had kept them in the shadow of what she could be, she had become someone with the power to change everything. Now, when the world looked at her, it was through the eyes of those who, for the first time, understood that not all stories need to be told by those who raised us. Sometimes, they are told by those who choose, with great difficulty, to rewrite their own destiny. The silence was heavy, almost palpable, filling every corner of the house like a dense, suffocating fog. That silence was present in the small details, in the muffled sound of footsteps throughout the house, in the faint ticking of the clock in the living room, in the dry sound of doors closing slowly but with a precision that seemed intentional. It was a silence that carried with it a sense of absence, as if words, gestures, and feelings had been left behind, trapped in an invisible web that suffocated any attempt at genuine communication. When she entered the house that day, she knew something was about to happen. There was a sense of finality in the air, as if time had stood still, waiting to be marked by a definitive moment. She sat at the dinner table, where the atmosphere was always filled with conversation, laughter, and busy work, but today, everyone's gaze was scattered. Her mother, hands in her lap, stared intently at the plate in front of her, avoiding all eye contact. Her father was lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the newspaper he held in his hands, but not actually reading it. Her sister, normally so close, was now across the table, as distant as the strangeness that hung between them. The emptiness of the words was deafening. None of the usual conversation, no casual comment about her day, or even a question about how she was. Nothing. She knew deep down that this was the last time she would sit at that table. The last dinner. But none of the family members seemed willing to acknowledge it. The goodbye never came. It was unsaid. It was unasked. There was no tight hug, no expression of affection. Nothing that could somehow soften the stark reality. That something was breaking irreversibly. What the family offered was a kind of indifference that spoke louder than any scream or accusation. A kind of silence that wasn't just a gap between words, but a wall erected between her and everything that had been her life up until then. Her mother's silence was the most painful. Teresa had always been the figure of affection, the woman who held the house together with her gentle gestures and soft laughter. Yet, at that moment, she seemed distant, as if trying to shield herself from some pain that couldn't be shared. She wouldn't look at Camille. The words that were never spoken formed in the air like an invisible veil. "I can't bear to watch this anymore," seemed to be written in her absent gaze. She didn't know how to express what she felt, and neither did Camille. Everything was muffled. All the love, all the anger, all the resentment, everything was transformed into silence. And her father? Manuel, always so firm, always so authoritative, now seemed completely lost in his own thoughts. He, who used to rule the house with an iron fist, who had always been the pillar of morality and respect within that family structure, was now there, quiet, almost non-existent. Camille looked at him, but found there not the figure who had raised her. There was no longer the demand for respect, for obedience, but an abyss of incomprehension. He didn't know what to say. And perhaps, deep down, he felt there was nothing left to say. He had already decided that she no longer fit into his life, that her presence was no longer welcome. She had become a flaw in a carefully planned family project. Isabella's silence was also noticeable, but in a different way. Her older sister had always been the star of the family, the perfect daughter, the one who always conformed to expectations. She was her father's pride, the successor to his ideals. But now, when Camille looked at her, she saw a strange being. Isabella was there physically, but her mind seemed far away. There was no contempt or overt anger in her gaze, but an apathy that, in a way, was even more cutting. It was as if she had been programmed to follow the order of things, and seeing her sister's silent disintegration, she knew there was something there that could not be repaired. There was nothing to be said. Camille felt the weight of those hours. The weight of what was never spoken. It wasn't just a matter of words, it was a matter of a lack of them. She wanted to scream. She wanted to ask what had happened. She wanted to demand an explanation, a reason for being discarded as if she had never been part of that family. But what did she do? She remained silent. Because, deep down, she knew nothing she said would make a difference. They had already decided. And she, with her silent grief, knew that words would be in vain. When the meal was over, Camille got up and headed to her room. Nothing was said. No final glance, no apology, no attempt at reconciliation. It was the end, and there was nothing to be done. She hadn't expected a warm farewell, but a simple word, a simple goodbye, would have been enough to mark the end of that era. Instead, what she got was the silence of a house that no longer knew how to welcome its own members. That night, she gathered her things. Her parents were in other rooms, and her sister's head was down, lost in her own thoughts. No one rose to help her, no one offered a supportive glance. And though she was about to leave, Camille didn't know if she could call that moment a farewell. How could she say goodbye to a family that no longer acknowledged her presence? How could she close a part of her life that seemed long since buried? She packed her bags in silence, each gesture her way of coping with the pain, and deep down, she knew nothing else mattered. She took one last look at the familiar objects around the room. Every memory she carried was there, but their presence seemed to have no value. Camille knew that, at that moment, what awaited her was a lonely path. Far from the people she called family. She got up, grabbed her suitcase, and walked out the door, without a "I'll see you later," without an "I'm sorry," or a "goodbye." Only silence followed them. She never looked back. The sound of the door slamming was the last trace of her presence in that house. And although the door closed behind her, what remained was the feeling that, contrary to what she expected, she wasn't leaving. She was, in fact, breaking free. And for her, that silence wasn't a condemnation, but a kind of rebirth. The goodbye didn't happen the way she expected, but perhaps silence was the most honest farewell she could have had. No words were needed, no gestures were needed. What remained was the empty space between her and her family, a space she was finally ready to fill with her own story. The house was full of memories. Not the kind you see in the photos adorning the walls or in Sunday conversations about what happened when someone was a child. Not the kind kept alive by the warmth of a family hug or shared laughter around a table. No, what remained was the silence of a distorted history, a carefully erased memory. Camille knew this better than anyone. It was as if she had never existed. As if, at some point, her presence had been erased from the family narrative, silenced by an invisible and unexplained act. When she looked at the walls of the house where she grew up, what caught her attention most wasn't the carefully placed furniture or the painting on the wall of her parents' wedding, but the fact that she wasn't there. Her face wasn't in the photos. Nor were her important moments recorded as a reminder that she was part of that story. She wasn't part of it anymore. It all started with the removal of the photos. It may have been a gradual process, almost imperceptible to those who weren't paying attention, but for Camille, it was like a sharp knife cutting the remaining bond. When she was younger, the walls of her house were covered with framed pictures. Photos of vacations, birthdays, happy moments that, in her eyes, seemed to represent the true essence of family life. There were photos of her parents with their respective achievements, photos of Isabella in her academic and sports competitions, but none of them with her. As the years passed, the photographs began to disappear. It wasn't a major event or an overt action that caught Camille's attention. It was something subtle, almost painless to others, but it caused her a pain she couldn't explain. She remembered a specific photo, one of her and her sister, both still young, holding colorful balloons and smiling for the camera. It was an image that represented a time when her family's love and unity were evident. But the moment she realized the photo had been removed from the wall and replaced with one of Isabella alone, a kind of shadow settled over her heart. It wasn't just a photo. It was the deletion of a part of her history. As if that moment had no value, as if that smile she shared with her sister wasn't worth preserving. Over time, the other photos began to follow suit. The picture of Camille on her 15th birthday, which once hung proudly on the mantelpiece, disappeared without explanation. The framed photo of her first day of school was replaced by a more recent one of Isabella, who, of course, stood out with her perfect smile, always the exemplary daughter, always the chosen one. The feeling of being a mistake grew stronger with each disappearing photo. Camille felt like an intruder in her own past, as if the version of herself she had of herself was being erased forever. She no longer saw photos of her parents as a close-knit family. Instead, she saw images that depicted a unity built around artificial perfection. They were creating a story, but one that didn't include her. Her face, what she represented, had been removed from the narrative without anyone bothering to ask if she cared. In that house, where she had once been a daughter and sister, she was now merely an absence, a stain no one wanted to see. And what hurt her most was not just the fact that the photos were removed, but the fact that no one talked about it. Her presence, once recognized in the images, was progressively erased from everyday conversations. Previously, stories about past events were always filled with shared memories, but she soon realized that her name was never mentioned again. Camille would delicately try to insert a memory from her own past into the conversation, perhaps talking about a trip she and her mother had taken, or a time she won an award at school, but nothing came of it. The conversations moved on, as if her voice were just a discordant note in the middle of a well-rehearsed melody. When she tried to recall an important family event, like the Christmas her grandmother was there, or the day she won first place in the science competition, there was a strange sense of unease in the air. The topic was quickly diverted to something more comfortable, more acceptable. It was as if her memory were a burden, a memory that shouldn't be brought up. She tried to say, with some lightness, "I remember when Dad taught me to ride a bike." But the blank looks she received from her parents and Isabella said it all. "Let's talk about something else." Her memory had become a weight, a burden no one wanted to carry. And, unbeknownst to her, this weight also began to accumulate within her. The emptiness was profound. The pain of being disregarded, of being unrecognized, became a seemingly bottomless pit. She no longer knew how to cope with the feeling that her existence had been minimized, much less with the idea that her memories were being erased, as if her life had been of no importance to the family that should have been her foundation. The cruelest blow, however, came when, after leaving the house, Camille tried to reconnect with what remained of her family history. She discovered, in a cold and distant way, that every reference to her presence had been systematically erased from the family archives. Photos, documents, memories, everything. She knew that, by leaving, her name had become unwelcome within the house, but the weight of seeing it materialized was something that shook her deeply. Their story now no longer had a Camille, no longer a laugh, no longer a reminder of her presence. They had rewritten themselves, remade their narrative, and Camille was no longer part of it. She was a blank page, a forgotten note. It was as if, in those moments, the space she had occupied her entire life had been erased with an invisible marker. What remained was a house full of photos where she had never been. Where the smiles she had given, the words she had spoken, the moments she had lived had no value. She didn't know exactly when this had happened, but one thing was clear: the story her family told no longer featured her as the protagonist. Camille no longer existed for them, and now, not even for her. When she looked at that house for the last time, she knew she would never be able to go back. There was no longer any room for her there. Her story had been erased, and even if she wanted to rewrite it, nothing could restore what was lost. The house that had once been her home now became a place where she could no longer find her roots, her connections. The hardest part of all was that, in that moment, she realized that, no matter how hard she tried to reconnect with her history, the only thing she could do was move forward, with the memory of who she had been erased. The world outside was vast and unforgiving, and unlike the home where she grew up, it offered neither the comfort of family routine nor the security of a place where love was supposed to be a given. Camille was no longer at home, and reality, stripped of the mask of family home, greeted her with all its harshness and complexity. Yet, within this cold reality, she found a bitter freedom. The absence of her family was both a condemnation and an opportunity for reinvention. Suddenly, without the judgmental eyes of home, the pressure to fit into a mold never meant for her, Camille had to rebuild herself, from scratch, and search for a place where she could finally be herself. When she left home, she didn't know where to go. What she had was an uncertain path, a piece of herself that was broken and in need of healing, but she had no idea how that process would begin. All she knew was that she needed to get away. The weight of family rejection was too great to carry inside a house where the memories of her exclusion were etched on the walls, the furniture, even the silence. Camille threw herself out of that space, as if it were possible to leave behind not only the house, but everything she had been in that place. In the early days, everything was very difficult. She didn't have enough money to settle comfortably, so she found herself in a big city, feeling like just another anonymous person among the many who make up the urban jungle. The streets were impersonal and cruel. People passed by without looking, the shop lights shone without promising warmth. She had no friends nearby, no support network, no one to lean on. And that was what scared her most. She was alone. Truly alone. And for the first time, she realized how indifferent the world could be. In the early days, Camille sought shelter wherever she could. She slept with temporary friends, but their kindness soon wore thin. She didn't want to be any more of a nuisance than necessary, so she ended up resorting to the only place where she felt truly safe, the streets. Reflecting her disconnection from everything she had ever known, she settled for shared rooms in cheap hostels and, later, a small apartment where loneliness became a constant companion. She worked whatever it took. From waitressing in a simple restaurant to cleaning a doctor's office, Camille found a way to keep herself busy, to distract herself from the inner turmoil that consumed her. The work didn't demand much of her soul, which, paradoxically, was something she needed. Work, though arduous, became a neutral ground where she could hide the scars of her soul, not the ones visible, but the ones no one else could see. There was no one to ask about her history, no one to offer judgment. And this kind of made her feel invisible. Not in the sense of exclusion, but in the sense of the tranquility that comes when no one knows who you really are. It was the kind of invisibility that, unlike family, didn't cause her pain, instead, it gave her a respite. And it was in this isolation that Camille began to find herself, not through interaction with others, but through introspection. Without family expectations, without the pressure to be perfect or follow the paths imposed on her, she could finally observe herself. What did she enjoy? What truly made her smile? In the whirlwind of her solitary journey, she discovered a passion, art. Since childhood, Camille had always drawn, but she was never allowed to pursue it as a valid path. Within the invisible prison of her family, art was seen as a distraction. Something with no real value. But now, far from everything that limited her, she allowed herself to explore. She enrolled in a nighttime painting class. With paints and brushes, she began to create intensely, almost therapeutically. Each brushstroke seemed to lift a piece of the pain she carried within. She painted herself on the canvases as a way of recognizing herself again. She reconnected with her own being, with her essence, which until then had been so repressed. The canvases began to fill with solitary figures, with landscapes that seemed to reflect the inner emptiness she felt, but also the silent strength that kept her going. Over time, Camille not only developed her artistic skills but also became more attentive to the subtleties of life. She began to see beauty in simple things, the sunlight reflecting off a puddle, the rhythm of busy streets, the gentle smile of a person who suddenly recognized her. She found in her art a voice she hadn't had before, a way to speak without words. She began to understand that, even if no one in her family had noticed, she had an important story to tell. Art became her form of resistance. It was her way of asserting her existence, of showing herself to the world, even if no one knew where she came from. The nights were difficult. When she went to bed in her small apartment, the emptiness seemed to fill her unbearably. Not because of the lack of people around her, but because of the lack of emotional connection with others. She never wanted to be seen as a victim, but loneliness often engulfed her, and she had to learn to live with it. No longer part of that family narrative, completely invisible to her parents, was a constant burden. But as the months passed, she learned not to rely on others' acceptance to define herself. She became her own source of motivation. She began frequenting cafes and museums, her eyes ever watchful, ever observing, ever searching for something more than what she saw on the surface. What interested her wasn't the frantic pursuit of success, but rather the search for a deeper understanding of herself and the world around her. She was discovering a sense of self, something that didn't depend on what others said was important. Art, books, conversations with strangers, all became part of the path she needed to travel. And though she knew her journey was hers alone, she felt that, in the end, she could transform her pain into something beautiful, something she could share with others. Little by little, the walls of her solitude were filled with the colors and traces of her own experience. She was no longer a victim of a story forged without her. She had become the author of her own life, and this gave her a sense of freedom she had never imagined. And, as lonely as the path was, Camille knew it was leading her to something much greater. She was, indeed, finding herself. She didn't need validation to be valid. She didn't need to be remembered by her family to matter. And, even without being recognized by those who had once been her everything, Camille was, for the first time, learning to be seen by herself. It was on a gray morning, with the sky heavy with clouds that seemed trapped in a tangled storm, that everything changed. Camille was in her small apartment, which, though modest, had something welcoming about the ordered chaos she maintained. There, her paintbrushes and canvases scattered around the room gave her a sense of control, an illusion of stability in a world that had abandoned her. She was accustomed to the solitary routine: coffee, painting, long walks around the city. The loneliness that once consumed her no longer suffocated her in the same way. She had found a path within herself, even without knowing what the future held. However, that morning, the future took an unexpected turn, a turn that took her straight to the center of a world she never imagined she would be a part of. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day when you lose yourself in monotony. Camille sat at the table, a cup of coffee in her hands, her gaze fixed on one of her paintings, trying to decide what to do next. The sun, as always, tried to break through the clouds but failed, making the light in the room cold and distorted. Suddenly, the sound of her cell phone, which had been forgotten next to her cup, cut through the morning stillness. The number was unfamiliar, and for a moment, she hesitated. However, something inside told her to answer. The tone of his voice was tense, as if there was an urgency behind the call. Camille Reyes? The voice on the other end held a calm authority, firm but unhurried. Camille felt a sudden pressure in her chest, as if that name, spoken so formally, had been wrenched from somewhere deep within her. Yes, it's her, Camille replied, already knowing this was no ordinary call. Who's calling? My name is Robert Hayes. I work for a division of the federal government. We are contacting you because your profile has been identified as essential to a national security operation. I need you to listen to us carefully. This is an urgent proposal. Those words fell upon Camille like a silent avalanche. She could barely process them. Not only because of the surprise, but also because of the impersonal and calculated tone, as if she were being called to something that transcended any notion of normality. Essential for an operation, she thought, but before she could ask more, the voice continued. We can't explain all the details right now, but your experience in high-pressure environments, your ability to handle complex tasks, and your ability to adapt quickly to unexpected situations make you a unique candidate for a highly classified mission. We're proposing that you join us. As you know, the Pentagon maintains high standards of secrecy, so we can't release any more information until you accept. Camille didn't know what to make of this information. What exactly did it mean to be essential to a covert operation? She spent the next few seconds trying to process what was happening, but panic began to set in, mixed with a twinge of excitement. She was being invited into a world where everything she knew, her identity, her solitary life, her art, would be left behind. She was being invited to be part of something much bigger than herself. Those words from a stranger, spoken with such authority, were like a key, slowly turning, opening a door she never imagined possible. You're asking me to be part of a secret mission? Something military? Camille managed, her voice almost cracking. She'd never imagined that the life she'd chosen, far from everything that excluded her, would lead her to something so far from her reality. Nothing about her trajectory seemed to align with what was being offered. We're not talking about a conventional military mission, Camille. We're talking about something much more nature of your past. The way you've dealt with adversity, your ability to disappear into the shadows, to redefine yourself, that's what we're looking for. We can't go into details right now, but you'll be part of an operation that could change the course of international security issues. Your ability to work discreetly and your ability to adapt to new identities make you a valuable asset to the mission. Camille felt as if she were sinking into an abyss, her mind spinning to make sense of what she had just heard. The word identity echoed in her head like an echo of something she had long tried to bury, but which now seemed to hold the key to something greater. The fact that the very skill she used to hide, to disappear into the shadows, was precisely what was attracting the government's attention made her question whether she had truly reinvented herself as she had imagined. Why me? There are so many other people with more qualifications than me, in more suitable positions, she asked, still trying to find logic in this unusual proposal. That's a good question, Hayes replied, with a measured pause. We can't reveal all the details, but I can say there's more to who you are than your formal experience. Your ability to understand complex contexts and act under pressure are rare traits. And in your situation, you already know the weight of carrying a secret. The operation we're planning is sensitive and will require someone with your emotional and mental resilience. Someone who, like you, isn't afraid to hide or redefine themselves. Camille knew this wasn't a coincidence. The Pentagon wouldn't randomly choose someone to participate in a covert operation unless there was something specific about her that appealed to them. She began to understand that the invitation wasn't about her academic qualifications or professional experience, but about something deeper, more personal. The fact that she had been erased, removed from history, made her a perfect choice for a mission that also required a certain invisibility. The offer was tempting, but at the same time terrifying. Camille found herself at the center of a dilemma. On the one hand, the proposal was an escape, an opportunity to enter a world where her past, her failures, her pain, could be left behind. She would have a chance to start over, with a greater, more dignified purpose. On the other hand, it meant abandoning her art, her simple life, and entering a world where control, surveillance, and secrecy would be the only constant. She knew this offer represented something that could not be undone. Once inside, there would be no going back. I need some time to think, she replied, her voice firmer than she expected. We understand, Camille. But the window for acceptance is short. The time is now. Once you enter, life as you know it will cease to exist. We can't wait much longer. The world needs you. She hung up the phone, still processing the weight of it. Whatever it was, this invitation would change her life forever. But one thing was certain, she was on the verge of a decision that would take her out of her lonely life and place her at the center of a story not even she could have foreseen. When Camille received the Pentagon's offer, she knew her life would never be the same. It wasn't a simple choice, there was no room for doubt or hesitation. What the government was proposing wasn't just a secret mission. It was a chance to live outside the shadows, but at the same time, a condemnation to a new existence where risk and uncertainty would be daily companions. She knew that her adaptation to this new world would be not just physical, but emotional. What was about to begin would be much more than training, it would be a total transformation. The process began quickly. The intensive training was described as immediate, and Camille found herself immersed in a world that seemed, in some ways, incomprehensible. The tension of knowing she was going into something so secret, so fraught with danger, made her stomach churn. From the moment she was asked to sign a confidentiality agreement, which granted her access to the world of the operation, the feeling of walking a fine line between freedom and imprisonment never left her. She was transported to an unfamiliar location, a training center, where the sun never seemed to shine the same way. There was something in the air, a constant sense of surveillance, as if the eyes of the government were watching her every move. Every step she took seemed measured, calculated, and there was no longer room for the spontaneity that had once defined her life. Nothing was simple anymore. Nothing was predictable anymore. Camille felt as if she were falling into a bottomless pit, where reflections of her former self distorted against the dark walls. The training, both physical and psychological, began immediately. The first few weeks were the most difficult. Camille underwent a series of endurance exercises, both physical and mental. Learning to hide, to camouflage, to be invisible without being noticed. To transform into a shadow no one could detect. She spent most of her time learning to control her instincts, to act without hesitation, to be cold and calculating. This wasn't just about overcoming a physical obstacle, but about understanding how to fit into a world where people's perceptions had to be effectively manipulated. Camille's ability to disappear, to redefine herself, now became her greatest asset. She was taught to use every form of communication possible without arousing suspicion. This ranged from disguise techniques to the use of advanced technology to create a false identity. There were classes on body language, how to misread an interviewer or opponent. The focus was on skills Camille never imagined she would need, such as document forgery and conversations without any trace of her true identity. The psychological training was undoubtedly the most challenging. There was no time for insecurities or vulnerabilities. Camille was forced to face her deepest fears, to understand what had driven her there. This wasn't just about being part of a covert operation. It was about understanding how much she had been shaped by a past she would need to leave behind. It was about coming to terms with the fact that, in the world she was now entering, there was no room for emotional weakness. Emotions were luxuries that could be costly, especially in such a volatile and dangerous field. Over time, she began to grow accustomed to the grueling routine and isolation. The long hours of training, the days without rest, the constant pressure to be perfect, to never fail. But at the same time, she began to see her reflection shaping into something new. Something stronger. Camille began to realize she was becoming someone different. With each passing day, she began to accept the fact that she was being shaped into a life of anonymity, a life where what mattered wasn't her name or what she had been, but what she would be capable of in the future. The physical training was challenging. Camille was no longer just painting pictures, but facing rigorous exercises that demanded more from her than anything she had done before. She ran, jumped, climbed, trained in combat, escape simulations, and extreme risk situations. She not only learned to defend herself, but to attack precisely, without hesitation. She learned to move silently, to hide in the shadows, to disappear. Every movement was meticulously observed. Every mistake was recorded. Every victory was celebrated in silence. It was a life of extreme discipline, where rest was a rare luxury. Furthermore, the psychological training deepened. Camille was forced to confront her own insecurities, the moments when family rejection had undermined her, the self-image that had been distorted and denied. But this training also offered her something powerful, the ability to see herself as a tool, someone who was beyond the failures of the past, someone with a clear mission ahead. The process was not gentle, but in the end, she found herself stronger, more centered, and more prepared to face any adversity that arose. The nights were long. When training ended, Camille would retreat to a small room, isolated, without the presence of her companions or friends. Alone with her thoughts, she mentally reviewed the day's learnings. Sometimes doubts surfaced, but she knew she couldn't let herself weaken. The mission was clear. The operation had to succeed, and that depended on her ability to remain invisible. To become a ghost, something that moved in the shadows but whose presence could not be ignored. As time passed, Camille's adaptation to this new reality became more natural. She became a key player in the operation, someone with skills that others often didn't fully understand but that were absolutely necessary. She now knew that her ability to disappear, to redefine and reinvent herself, was not only a defense against the world, but the key to being effective in this new role. She was no longer a rejected daughter, a forgotten sister. She was an operative, someone essential to the security of a country. The difference was that, deep down, Camille knew that now, her greatest challenge would be not losing herself in the process, not becoming something she had once been, invisible and without identity. The training was rigorous, but Camille knew that by the end, she would be ready. She was shaping a new version of herself, someone who didn't need a past to define her. Now, she was ready to act as an essential personnel, tasked with going where no one else could, doing what no one else could. She knew that in assuming this new role, she would have to leave behind the shadows of her past, but at the same time, carry the strength of everything she had become. A new identity, created not only by the government person who had walked through the doors of that secret center weeks earlier. The transformation she underwent wasn't just physical or psychological, it was a complete reconstruction of her identity. In a world where truth was malleable and anonymity a strategic weapon, she was forced to immerse herself in a new reality, where her name, her history, and her past had been deliberately erased. Now, she had to assume a new identity, forged not only by falsified documents, but by the reality of her own internal change. The moment she was handed her new identity was striking, but in a cold, clinical way. Camille sat in a windowless room, lit by a cold white light. Sitting at the table, she stared at the small stack of papers in front of her. The name on top of the documents was no longer Camille Reyes. There was no longer any connection to the family that had abandoned her, nor to the past she had chosen to leave behind. The name she had been given was generic, imposing, and, in a way, empty. A new identity. A new life. She took it in her hands, feeling the weight of what it meant, a complete disconnection from who she had been. Camille Reyes is no more, said a voice behind her, cold and impersonal. It was Robert Hayes, the officer who had recruited her. He stood beside a small computer, watching her intently. You are someone new now. The person you were will never be more than a shadow. His words echoed like a sentence. And in that moment, Camille understood that from that moment on, there was no going back. Her past, with all its pain and rejection, would be a distant memory, a memory she could no longer access. The new identity was not just a reconfiguration of documents, but a reconfiguration of who she would be from then on. She would no longer be the forgotten daughter, the rejected sister. The woman she would become had no room for flaws, for weaknesses, or doubts. She was now an operative, a key player in a top-secret operation, where her usefulness would come not from who she was, but from what she could do. The Camille of the past no longer had value. Everything she did, all her actions, were done under the new name and with a new mission. Adapting to her new role was a long and complicated process. The world she now inhabited was no longer that of a simple citizen. It was a world where the truth was constantly distorted, where you hid behind disguises and manipulated others' perceptions without them ever knowing who you really were. Camille, or rather, the new identity she now carried, was thrust directly into this world of darkness and shadows. She became an expert in infiltration, espionage, and highly complex operations. In the field, she was constantly on the move, jumping from one mission to the next, moving under perfect disguise, playing roles no one else could. She used new credentials, new passports, and new records, all meticulously crafted to ensure her true self remained hidden. Each mission she completed took her a little further away from the person she once was. She knew this new life required her to hide, not only from the world, but from herself. If the previous Camille was a woman who sought to reinvent herself through art, now she reinvented herself through silent, decisive actions. With each step, with each shift in identity, she found herself further removed from who she had been. The canvases she once painted were now replaced by secret reports, meticulous plans, and strategic calculations. The same creative mind she used to paint was now used to plot escape routes, evade surveillance, and infiltrate the most inaccessible places. However, the deepest challenge was undoubtedly the internal war she waged with herself. The identity she now carried was impersonal, without emotional attachments, without history. The name on her documents was like a blank slate, ready to be filled with anything. Sometimes she would find herself in moments of reflection, when the mission was over and she retreated to some secluded place, where no one could see her. In those moments, she tried to remember who she was before, the woman who walked through an unfamiliar city, the Camille who painted pictures, who looked at life with curiosity. But, try as she might, that woman felt like a version of herself that no longer existed, someone slowly being swallowed by the shadow of who she had become. Her new identity, far from being a simple construction of roles, became her armor, her protection against the world. The masks she wore were not just physical disguises, but a psychological construct that prevented her from losing herself. Camille had to learn to hide not only from government surveillance or any enemy, but from herself. She couldn't afford to remember what she had been, because if she did, she might lose control and, with it, lose the purpose of her mission. As the weeks passed, she became increasingly involved in covert operations, some of which could change the course of international affairs, others that simply required ruthless precision and a skill for adaptation she hadn't known she possessed. She was now an expert at manipulating reality, creating false stories, operating under false identities, and carrying out complex tasks with almost surgical precision. Camille Reyes, the woman who had once been discarded and forgotten, now became a key player in a national security operation, a trustworthy and effective agent who could move mountains without leaving a trace. Yet even with all the power her new identity granted her, Camille knew her humanity was at stake. The woman she had become was no longer someone who felt the pain of rejection, but someone who had learned to suppress her emotions, to set aside the need for connection, for empathy. The mission, the success of the operation, became the only things that mattered. And as she carried out her tasks efficiently, the emptiness within her grew ever greater. The real question was, how far would she lose herself to be effective? How far could her new identity fulfill her, without losing herself entirely in the process? Camille knew the answer was still far from being found, but with each successful mission, she felt another layer of her past peeled away, as if each step took her further away from the woman who had once dared to be seen. She was beginning to understand that by becoming a key player in a covert operation, she wasn't just creating a new identity, she was, in fact, becoming a completely different person. Camille found herself, once again, torn between two worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile. Her life outside of the covert operation was simple, almost mundane, with a routine that required nothing more than her presence. She worked in a small apartment, isolated from everything she knew as a family, but now with a sense of independence that had previously seemed unattainable. Her life outside the Pentagon training center was one of artificial stillness, where she allowed herself to rest, reflect, and try to salvage fragments of what had once been her identity. In those moments, she was simply a woman living in anonymity, with the freedom to be whoever she chose to be, no longer shadowed by a painful past or the pressure to meet external expectations. However, this reality was fleeting. Each mission she received brought her back to the heart of the covert operation. The parallel world she now lived in was not just a different physical space, but a constant transformation of her very being. The mere fact of being called on a mission meant that the Camille who hid behind a screen of disguises, of falsehoods, was about to emerge again, leaving behind the woman she tried to be outside of that reality. Within this other world, discipline was relentless, surveillance constant. And Camille's identity, as she had known it, became a mask, a lie she wore with the precision of a trained agent. The line between who she was before and who she needed to be for the government became increasingly blurred. What she experienced outside of the operation seemed like a peaceful dream, but when called back to a mission, Camille returned to what she called a reality, where danger, secrecy, and the weight of responsibility were ever present. In this parallel world, she was no longer an artist, no longer the woman rejected by her family, nor someone searching for self-discovery. She was a tool, a piece of a complex geopolitical puzzle moving in the shadows. She no longer had control over what was happening to her life, nor over the person she was becoming. The moments of tranquility, of anonymity, became brief breaths, short breaks before throwing herself headfirst into an operation where risk and uncertainty were the only certainties. The contrast between these two worlds, the public and the secret, was reflected in the small, subtle differences in her daily life. When she was in the training camp or in the middle of a mission, Camille wore an impersonal, cold identity, with no room for emotion. Her gestures were calculated, her words meticulously chosen. In the field, she was a machine, with no room for doubt or weakness. Every movement was made with precision. But when she returned to her life outside the operation, she felt her soul, for a moment, expand into something more human. There was no uniform, no secret missions, no disguises. She would sit at a cafe table, look out the window, and see the people around her as figures disconnected from her reality, their conversations shallow, no longer the urgency she faced behind the scenes of the operation. Life outside the training center, away from secret missions, increasingly became a search for normalcy, an attempt to anchor herself in something other than the identity forged by the government. For a brief time, she could allow herself to be simple Camille, a woman with an unknown past, but still trying to rediscover what it meant to live with, walk the streets aimlessly, and try to absorb the peace in small things, a cup of coffee in a quiet cafe, a walk without a destination, a smile from strangers who, for a few moments, seemed to see her as more than just a shadow. These moments became precious, but also incomplete. There was a constant feeling that she was living in two worlds, and that sooner or later, the curtain would rise on the darker side of her life. However, as time passed and Camille became more immersed in this parallel world, something inside her began to shift. What began as an escape, a way to reconnect with a simple life, was gradually replaced by the need to stay away, to protect herself from the temptation to relive old feelings of belonging. She could no longer afford to be vulnerable, to connect with the outside world, because she knew the mission required her complete dedication. The secret reality in which she now moved took a constant emotional toll. What she had left behind was no longer something that could be reconstructed. Her public identity was no longer hers to choose, she was now being defined by actions over which she had no control. The price of transitioning between these two worlds was high. Camille was becoming a master at hiding her own feelings. When faced with a high-risk mission, her emotions were silenced with brutal force. She had to be a ghost, a figure who existed only to carry out her assigned duties, without question. She had learned, over time, to disidentify from the woman who once sought acceptance from her family and others. Now, she slipped from one identity to the other, transforming herself for others, but gradually losing the ability to see herself as the same person. She was becoming the person the Pentagon needed, but she wondered to what extent that would be enough to keep her whole. On missions, she found herself in situations of extreme risk, in opaque and tense environments. The life of an operative was filled with uncertainty and pressure. Camille felt the limits of her humanity being tested with each new operation, where escape strategy, perfect disguise, and quick adaptation to the unexpected were essential for survival. There was no time for mistakes, and those who failed were quickly forgotten. She knew this, and with each mission, with each success, the weight of loneliness increased. The truth was that Camille now lived in two worlds, one where she sought personal purpose, a refuge from the shadows, and another where she became a key cog in a secret machine, nameless and faceless, someone who could no longer look back. With each mission, she delved deeper into this parallel world, where the risks were high and the reward came in the form of absolute anonymity. The more she surrendered herself to this secret life, the more difficult it became to reconnect with the world she once thought could be hers. The difference between the two worlds was clear. Outside the operation, she still had a chance to reclaim some of her humanity. Inside the operation, she was no longer Camille Reyes. She was simply an operative, a key cog moving in the shadows, leaving no trace. As Camille delved deeper into the secret life the Pentagon had created for her, a sense of freedom began to emerge, like a gentle breeze that, over time, grew stronger and more uncontrollable. Life outside her family, away from expectations and impositions, offered her something she hadn't imagined possible, a chance to break free. But this freedom didn't come without a price. To achieve inner peace and embrace her new identity, Camille had to cut the last threads connecting her to the past, not only family memories but also the invisible burdens she carried within. When she decided to distance herself from her family, something inside her was indeed freed, but not immediately. There was always the hope, however vague, of reconciliation, a moment when her actions and choices would be understood. But that hope began to fade as the years passed and the distance between her and her family grew wider. The unspoken words, the unsent messages, the unanswered calls became invisible walls, and although Camille still held on to the memories of the good times, her consciousness gradually grew accustomed to the idea that family was no longer an option for belonging. She would no longer be the daughter everyone expected, nor the sister who had to follow a defined role. Her life was now being built from scratch, devoid of the bonds that once seemed to be her only truth. For Camille, letting go wasn't a sudden decision, but a gradual journey of acceptance. She began to realize that the suffering she felt stemmed not only from the rejection she experienced in her youth, but from the pressure she imposed on herself to fit a narrative that was never hers. For years, she tried to reconnect with a family that saw her as a failure, trying to fulfill expectations that had nothing to do with who she truly was. She tried to please, tried to be accepted, tried to be what they wanted her to be, but now, in the silence of secret missions and in the moments of solitude after each operation, she understood a profound truth: the acceptance she sought would not come from outside. She needed to give herself the freedom to be who she truly was. Over time, she learned to emotionally detach herself from those expectations. It wasn't easy. At first, there was a sense of lack, a hole that seemed impossible to fill. But as she delved deeper into her new life and became an essential part of the covert operation, something inside her began to transform. With each mission, with each identity she assumed, she felt another layer of who she had been being deconstructed. In place of that woman weakened by family expectations, emerged a woman capable of moving through the world unrecognized, someone who no longer needed to justify or explain herself. Detachment wasn't a rejection of what she'd experienced, but an acceptance that what was to come was more important. She realized that her worth no longer depended on her family history, that she no longer needed to be Manuel and Teresa's daughter, nor Isabella's sister, to define who she was. The past, with all its wounds and rejections, began to slowly dissolve, like a distant nightmare that, though still present, no longer controlled her actions or decisions. She no longer needed to seek anyone's approval to be someone. She was now the author of her own story. This liberation was an ongoing process. By embarking on increasingly complex and high-risk missions, Camille distanced herself from what society considered normal or acceptable. In the world she now lived in, where everything was secretive and controlled, she empowered herself to be a completely new version of herself, one that didn't have to bow to the pressure of pleasing others or fitting into a role that didn't belong to her. She was a Pentagon operative, someone no longer rooted in the past, someone who moved in the present and built the future with her own hands. And it was in this new role, far from the shadows of her family, that Camille found a sense of peace. She no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. She began to embrace her secret identity with pride, knowing that, unlike her previous life, this new identity was not tied to any emotional burden. She no longer needed to seek validation from those who had discarded her. Now, she saw herself as a strong woman, capable of things few could even imagine. The name Camille Reyes no longer meant anything. What mattered was what she was doing now, the impact she was having on the world through her new identity. And most importantly, she was at peace with it. Letting go of family and social expectations wasn't a betrayal of her past, but a way to finally free herself from the shackles that kept her trapped in a narrative that never represented her. She realized that true freedom came from the internal recognition that she no longer needed to be imprisoned by the story others had created for her. She freed herself from the fear of judgment, from the burden of approval she'd always sought, and accepted that her worth wasn't tied to what others thought of her. When Camille looked at herself, she no longer saw herself as the rejected girl or the woman desperately trying to fit in. She now saw herself as someone capable of rewriting her own story, as someone who took control of her own destiny, without looking back. She was finally in charge of her own life, with all the mistakes and successes she had made along the way. Now, her identity was tied to what she did, not to who she was. She became a free woman, capable of adapting, of reinventing herself at every step, unburdened by a past that no longer defined her. Camille finally understood that true liberation lay in no longer needing the acceptance of others, not her family, not society. The only person she needed to please was the woman she became with each mission accomplished, with each new step taken toward building her new life. And so, she embraced her new life with the certainty that, finally, she was living for herself. The impact was immediate, like a silent explosion reverberating through the walls of the house that had once been Camille's home. Until then, she had been a forgotten memory, a figure erased from the family narrative. But now, suddenly, her name, the name that had been excluded, ignored, and suppressed, resurfaced on the television screens, echoing in hushed, murmured conversations throughout the house. The discovery didn't come about through a major confrontation, nor through a letter filled with accusations. No, the revelation came in the most unexpected way possible, through the media. It was a normal day, and the family was gathered together, as they had so often been, trying to discussing her recent exploits in the prosecutor's office, when the television, on in the background, showed a special report. The headline on the screen caught the eye: Governor Camille Reyes, the rise of a key figure in national security operations. The name Camille Reyes made the air in the dining room heavy, as if a chilly wind had swept through, bringing with it an irrefutable revelation. Camille, the lost daughter, the one who had been forgotten, was now all over the news, as someone with power and relevance, a woman who had become the face of a covert operation involving matters of national security. Camille was no longer a faded fragment of the family's memory. She was now a governor, a leader, a vital operative on a highly classified mission. For the family, this was like a blow to the gut. The moment Camille's name was uttered, her father Manuel's gaze hardened. His eyes, which had previously reflected the coldness of rejection, were now fixed on the screen, absorbing every word of the article, trying to understand what was happening. There was no longer the same disdain as before, nor the idea that she had been a failure to be erased. Now, Camille was a woman with power, influence, and, most importantly, a story no one knew, a story being told without their participation. He tried to understand how someone he had deemed irrelevant had achieved such status. Isabella, who had always been the pride of the family, now faced an equally disconcerting revelation. She knew who Camille was, but that Camille was no longer the quiet, self-effacing girl she remembered. The woman on screen, with her imposing posture and firm words, seemed a reflection of everything she had ever imagined Camille could be. How could this be? How had she, the sister who had always been on the margins, become so essential? Isabella's discomfort was palpable. She had always believed the family's success was tied to her, but now, in front of the television, she felt as if the rug had been pulled out from under her feet. Camille was no longer the forgotten sister, the wrong sister. She was now a central figure, a key part of something much bigger than either of them imagined. Teresa, Camille's mother, was the slowest to react. Her face, normally a mask of emotional Restraint now looked older, more weary, as if the walls of her life, which she had tried so hard to preserve, were crumbling before her. The silence was heavy. She didn't know what to feel. There was a part of her that wanted to feel proud, a part that wanted to celebrate her daughter's rise, but there was another that was immersed in guilt, in a feeling that, somehow, Camille's success was also an indictment against her. As a mother, she had never been able to recognize her daughter's worth, and now the world was reminding her of her failure. Camille was no longer the girl she had let go without a goodbye. She was someone who had somehow grown up without relying on anyone, without waiting for validation. The news didn't take long to spread. When the story aired, social media began to buzz with speculation about who Camille Reyes really was. Some saw her as a heroine, others as a pawn in a larger game, but for her family, the biggest revelation wasn't what she did, but what she became. Camille was no longer an unknown, a blank slate, ashamed to be hidden. She was now a woman who had made a name for herself, far from the walls of a home where she was never recognized. The discovery was a shock, a fissure in the foundation of what the family thought they knew about themselves. Manuel, the father, tried to deal with it the way he always dealt with crises, with rigidity, with attempts to control the narrative. He immediately got on the phone, calling acquaintances and asking for more information, trying to understand what Camille had done and how it might affect his image. He was, once again, worried about the family's image. Not about what his daughter had achieved, but about what it meant to him. The weight of rejection, now multiplied by the surprise of seeing her in a leadership role, made him feel vulnerable in a way he never imagined possible. Isabella, on the other hand, watched, unsure of what to say. She wanted the world to know that she had always been the chosen one, the perfect one. But now, with Camille's rise, she was confronted with a truth that disconcerted her. Camille had not been left behind, as she had thought. She had reinvented herself, overcome, and now she was in the spotlight, with the whole world watching her, admiring her strength, her intelligence, and her resilience. Camille's mother, Teresa, was the first to break the silence. She tried to call Camille, but knew deep down that it wouldn't be the same conversation. The past, with all the unspoken words and unexplained hugs, could no longer be recalled. Camille, while seemingly unstoppable, now became even more distant. The woman she was now seemed a reflection of the rejection and abandonment she had suffered, and at the same time, a victory over everything that had tried to crush her. Camille didn't answer the call. Not because she didn't care, but because she knew her journey no longer involved the validation of those who rejected her. She had built her own story, and now all that remained was to watch her family discover that she was no longer the invisible girl they had tried to forget. She had become someone who no longer needed them to be who she was. And in that moment, seeing her mother, father, and sister paralyzed by the revelation, Camille felt neither anger nor sadness. She felt, finally, the sense that she had broken free from the invisible chain that had always bound her, the one that had made her doubt her own worth. She no longer needed to be accepted. She no longer needed to be seen the way they wanted her to be. The world now saw her for who she truly was, and that was enough. The family's discovery was the final piece needed for Camille to understand that, contrary to what she thought, invisibility was never the problem. The problem had always been not seeing herself. Now, she knew exactly who she was. The revelation of Camille's role in Pentagon operations was not a simple event, it was an earthquake. The first time she appeared in the news as the essential to the operation was a turning point not only in her life, but in the way the world began to see her. The impact was immediate, and speculation reached uncontrollable proportions, dragging her name, her image, and her story into the media spotlight. Camille, once an invisible figure, was now at the center of a story she never imagined she was living. The news was released by an investigative journalist from one of the largest television networks. Camille Reyes, the governor who changed the game, the headline read, followed by a subtitle that bluntly highlighted Camille's central role in the covert operation that dealt with international threats. Investigative journalism, always alert to any movement within the spheres of power, quickly brought to light details about the operation's impact and how Camille had become key to the mission's success. The way she was described in the reports, as a woman essential to national security, sparked a wave of unanswered questions, generating a frenzy on social media and in the news. The first major shock came from the international media. Soon after publication, the article was republished on numerous websites and newspapers around the world. In an interview Camille never gave, a reporter described her rise enigmatically. She's the kind of person who moves in the shadows, but whose footsteps reverberate like thunder. The world was fascinated by the idea that a woman, who years before seemed to have been written out of her own history, was now at the center of one of the most secret and influential operations in world politics. The initial reactions were pure fascination, mixed with insatiable curiosity. Camille was an unknown quantity, someone whose story no one knew completely, but whose actions spoke louder than any words. The press began to build a narrative around her, but, as always happens with figures of power, speculation ran rampant. Some saw Camille as a heroine, a figure fighting behind the scenes to protect the country's interests. Others, however, were more skeptical. How had she become such an essential part of the operation? What were the hidden details about her past? What truly made her such a crucial choice? In politics, her rise created a whirlwind. Influential figures began to question who she really was, how someone with such little visibility before could now hold such a strategic position. It wasn't long before allies and opponents alike began to speculate about her role. The opposition, especially, saw Camille as a silent threat, and some voices began to emerge, suggesting that she might be being manipulated by forces beyond the public's control. Theories began to circulate. Was she a government puppet, or was she truly acting autonomously to shape the future of international security? These speculations weren't limited to the world of politics. The media began to delve into her past, searching for any clue that might explain her meteoric rise. News about her life before the operation, her family rejection, her shift in identity, began to be retold, but now with a new focus. What had previously seemed like a story of failure and abandonment was now reframed as one of resilience and adaptation. Camille, the invisible daughter, the woman forgotten by her family, was now seen as someone who had reinvented herself, a true phoenix rising from the ashes of her own past. Her family had imagined her to be. Her father, Manuel's, reaction was the most tense of all. In interviews with the press, he tried to disguise his surprise and discomfort, but the signs were clear. He didn't know how to deal with the daughter he had tried to erase, but who was now at the center of a large-scale operation. His words, once cold and distant, now became vague and defensive. Isabella, for her part, was pressured by the media's questions, but her approach was more calculated. She tried to maintain the facade of someone who had always known Camille's importance, someone who had always believed she had something to offer the world. But the falseness of her words was palpable. What the cameras didn't capture was the sense of insecurity Isabella felt as she watched her sister become the center of a story she thought was hers. Camille was now being recognized on a level Isabella never imagined she would reach. This generated an emotional pressure her sister had never known how to handle, and a competition that, previously veiled, was now blatant. The news spread even further. The public was divided. Some saw Camille as a silent heroine, a woman who had earned her place in the world through her own merit. Others saw her as a cog in a larger scheme, a cog in a machine that had not yet been fully revealed. For many, the question remained, how can someone with so little public record be considered essential to a covert national security operation? However, what was most interesting was the effect this discovery had on Camille. Until then, she had lived anonymously, a shadow to the outside world, living with a clear purpose and without needing to be recognized. Now, with her life exposed and everyone's eyes on her, something inside her shifted. The woman who had once been invisible, voiceless, was now a leader. The operation was no longer just a duty, it was her life. She knew that by being revealed to the world, she would be seen in every possible way, and that how the world interpreted her would define her future. The freedom she had so longed for was now diluted by a new pressure, being seen, being analyzed, being judged. The outside world now had her face, her name, her purpose. Camille was thrust back into the public spotlight, but this time, she was no longer the person hiding in the shadows. She had a greater mission, a story that would finally be told on her own terms. She knew this visibility would bring consequences, but for the first time, she was ready to face them. The game was different now. It was an ordinary day when the news arrived. The television was on in the living room, with the family gathered around the screen, as always. Manuel, still worried about the state of the company, Isabella discussing the new developments in her office, and Teresa, silent, looking at her husband, as if words were still missing for everything happening around them. The atmosphere felt charged, like the old days, where family tensions were hidden under a cloak of formality. But nothing could prepare the family for what was about to happen. In the midst of a trivial conversation about the family's future, Camille's image appeared on the screen. The first reaction was almost imperceptible, a blink, a sudden movement, an exchange of glances that quickly faded under the pressure of the moment. But when the name was announced, and the camera cut to an imposing image of Camille at an international security event, the room froze. It was as if time had stopped, and the world was about to reveal something no one had anticipated. The name, Camille Reyes, was no longer a distant echo, no longer a faded memory. Now, it was an imposing title, a mark of power and importance. The phrase, essential to a covert national security operation, seemed to resonate throughout the house. Like thunder in the stillness. Camille, once the ignored daughter, the forgotten sister, was now all over the news, described as a woman crucial to the country's security. The contrast between the woman her family knew and the imposing figure projected on the screen was like a direct blow to the heart of their story. Manuel, the patriarch, stared at the screen. He said nothing, but the weight of his expression clearly indicated he was processing the revelation, still in shock. Removed from the political world and always focused on maintaining the family's image, the idea that his daughter was now at the center of a secret security operation seemed surreal. He didn't know whether to feel proud or ashamed, but above all, he felt a pang of fear. The figure he had tried to control, the daughter he had disregarded, now held far greater power than he ever imagined. Camille was becoming something greater than any of his children, a key player in a political game far greater than her family's reach. Isabella, in turn, was overcome by a mixture of surprise and discomfort as the daughter who had always been the chosen one, the one always in the spotlight. The revelation that Camille now occupied a prominent role was not only disconcerting, it was almost a threat to her own place in the family. Isabella had always been seen as Manuel's successor, the perfect girl who always did everything right, without missteps, without flaws. Seeing Camille, the sister she had ignored, now in a position of absolute power, left her with a sense of helplessness she didn't know how to deal with. She felt herself crumbling inside, as if her very identity were slowly being undone, without her being able to do anything to hold it together. She tried to hide her reaction, maintaining control, but insecurity was written all over her face. Her look at the screen was no longer one of respect or admiration, but of conflict. How had her sister, whom she had always regarded with a mixture of indifference and disdain, become the central figure in an international narrative, a woman now gaining more prominence than she ever would? Isabella tried to convince herself that this didn't affect her, but she knew that somewhere deep inside, the competition between them, silent and often ignored, was finally being revealed to the world. Teresa, the matriarch, was the most affected of all. As a mother, she had always blamed herself for not being able to protect her children from their own frustrations. But Camille was more than a symbol of failure. She represented a lost love, an unhealed pain, an absence that had become too real to ignore. When she saw her daughter on the screen, so distant, so transformed, the weight of guilt and longing tightened her chest. There was a quiet sadness in Teresa's eyes, as she stared at the screen as if looking into a mirror, someone who, in an attempt to protect her family, failed to see what was truly happening to Camille. The silence of her absence was so present. Like a weight she had carried for years, and seeing her daughter finally shine, far from her protection, was both a revelation and a loss. Teresa didn't know what to feel. Pride? Regret? She stared at the figure now dominating the screen, a woman who was making history while she herself had been left behind, unable to accept the daughter life had given her. There was no more room for excuses, for explanations. The void left by Camille's absence grew even deeper as she began to understand that her daughter was far away, irretrievably distant, in a world she could no longer access. The revelation was like a shattered mirror, with pieces of feelings and memories scattered throughout the house. The family tried to react, tried to find words, but words would never be enough to express what they were feeling. The forgotten sister, the ignored daughter, the marginalized woman, was now at the center of the story, and no one knew how to deal with it. They were being confronted with the truth they never wanted to see. Camille was no longer the person they thought she was. She was a force, a woman who had overcome pain and rejection and become someone they, for so long, could not see. And now, she was beyond their reach. The family's reaction wasn't what Camille expected. She didn't expect reconciliation, nor immediate recognition. She knew her family would never understand what motivated her, what drove her to move on, to embrace a life without them. But seeing their reaction, realizing that Camille's figure, once invisible, had now become an impossible to ignore presence, brought a sense of silent revenge to her. It wasn't revenge in the classic sense, but the certainty that she had built something greater than anything her family could have offered. She had finally found her place in the world, and it no longer depended on their acceptance. Camille had become something she herself respected. She didn't need words to understand that, in that moment, the truth about who she was finally being revealed. She was no longer the lost daughter, the forgotten sister. She was a woman who had somehow managed to do what many believed she would never be able to do: reinvent herself, transform herself, and become essential to something greater than family or social life could define. And while her family digested the truth about who she had become, Camille continued to walk alone, but now with the security of knowing that her identity didn't depend on anyone else. She was finally free. The shock in Manuel and Teresa's home was profound, but more than that, it was silent, almost as if the reality of Camille becoming a vital cog in national security was something difficult to swallow. For her family, especially her father and sister, what was initially a surprise turned into a series of unsettling doubts and questions. The concept of Camille's disappearance, the act of removing her from the family narrative, no longer made sense. She had gone from being a mistake to be ignored to, in her fixed on the bedroom ceiling, trying to process how his daughter, the same one he had rejected, the one he considered an irreparable failure, had become a key player in a large-scale covert operation. It wasn't just an emotional shock, but also an identity crisis for him. How had he not realized Camille's importance before? How could he have been so blind as to lose someone who, in time, would become essential to national security? Manuel couldn't find easy answers, and it consumed him inside. He tried to find solace in the idea that Camille was finally doing something important, but the truth was that, more than pride, what he felt was immense blame. She was no longer the daughter he had despised. She was someone beyond what he could have imagined, someone with an autonomy, a power that made him feel powerless. Isabella didn't know how to handle it either. As this right daughter, the one who always stood out, the one who did everything right, her reaction to learning about Camille's role was a whirlwind of conflicting feelings. At first, what I felt was a kind of discomfort. How should she position herself in this situation? Camille, the sister who had never been taken seriously, who had been left aside, was now being revered. How could this be real? Isabella, who had always had her parents' support, always been the perfect daughter in their eyes, now found herself facing fierce competition. Not in terms of a direct fight for love or recognition, but for relevance. Camille, once invisible, was now at the center of a narrative everyone wanted to understand, but no one knew how to fit into. Isabella could never have predicted this. She had always thought that success, recognition, and family admiration were hers alone, but now Camille was taking her turn. She was leaving behind the image of the flawed daughter and showing the world that she was, in fact, more valuable than anyone could have imagined. This was too much for Isabella to bear. Teresa, for her part, was experiencing an even more painful conflict. She looked at Camille on the TV screen, but she could no longer see the girl who had once been her daughter. The woman who appeared before her was now strong, imposing, and seemed to be living a life completely separate from the woman she had tried to protect and care for. Teresa's first reaction was blame. There was a part of her that wanted to feel pride, but she couldn't separate it from the pain. Camille, the daughter she had let go so easily, was now at the center of a crucial international mission, and her own mother barely knew what to think. Teresa knew something was wrong. She had somehow failed to notice what was happening to Camille as she walked away, and that failure was the weight she now carried. She wondered silently, how could I let this happen? How could I not have seen it? There was no longer room for denial, nor for the comfort of knowing she had done everything she could. She knew that, somehow, Camille's choice to follow this path was a reflection of the pain her mother never realized she was causing. Teresa was beginning to realize that, despite being a mother, she had been responsible for denying her daughter the opportunity to be who she truly was. Now, Camille was presenting herself as someone who had somehow freed herself from that world, but at the cost of losing her connection to her family. The family's doubt was, in large part, a reflection of the internal conflict each of them was experiencing. They were facing a new reality, one where Camille was no longer the daughter they had thought was irrelevant. She was no longer on the margins of the family narrative. She was now at the center of a global story, one where her family no longer had control, and where her own image was being shaped by the world, with no way to erase it again. Manuel, Isabella, and Teresa were all wondering what this meant for them. How could they react to someone who, just a few years ago, was considered a failure, a worthless person, and now had become a key player in a secret international operation? They could no longer maintain the image of Camille they had before. And deep down, this made them feel threatened not just because of Camille's success, but because of what she represented, a woman who, having been rejected and forgotten, had found a way to reinvent herself, to build something with her own hands, and to be seen for who she truly was. This made them question their own choices, their own lives. Where did each of them belong now? Over time, doubt began to turn into an internal challenge for the family. They knew they could no longer ignore Camille, but how could they accept her? How could they accept that she had become someone they had, in some way, helped to exclude, and who was now changing everyone's story? Fear and insecurity gripped them. And the hardest part was knowing that the gap between the reality Camille was living and the reality they imagined her life to be was now irreparable. The question, then, wasn't just about who Camille was or what she had become. It was about how this change would force the family to confront itself, its failings, its omissions, and the weight of abandonment felt for so long. Camille had become the woman she always should have been, but her family was now missing out on being a part of it. And deep down, that was what shook them the most, not Camille being in the spotlight, but the certainty that she no longer needed them to shine. Camille sat by the window of her apartment, watching the city lights in the distance. The hustle and bustle of life outside, the constant movement of the streets, the people who came and went, unaware of who she really was or what she had become, all seemed so distant. She no longer felt the weight of family rejection, but a new kind of weight was beginning to settle in, responsibility. The journey that had taken her from an ignored daughter to a pivotal figure in a secret national security operation was complex and full of ups and downs, but more than anything, it brought her to a new level of self-discovery. At first, when she was called into the operation, she felt fearful, insecure, and hesitant. It was a role she hadn't chosen, but one that, somehow, she was destined to play. The weight of external expectations, the pressure to be something she wasn't sure she could be, the anguish of living under an identity that was no longer her own but that of the government, all of it suffocated her. But now, looking at the reflection of the city in the window, something inside her had shifted. She no longer saw herself as a discarded piece. Now, Camille knew that her role was much more than a supporting element, or supporting figure. She was a woman fundamental to the functioning of a country, a key cog in a complex machinery of security and strategy. This, in itself, was an acceptance of what she had become. For so long, she had felt rejected and invisible, as if she had no real purpose in the world. Her family, which should have been her foundation, had abandoned her, and the world around her seemed oblivious to her existence. She tried to reinvent herself, but the shadow of rejection followed her, and for a long time, she believed she would never be able to shake it. But now, after so long, she was finally beginning to understand that true strength came not from accepting others, but from accepting herself. The moment of acceptance of her new role was gradual. Each mission, each successful operation, each risk she took, gave her a growing sense of purpose. The world began to see Camille as someone who played a vital role on the international stage. But, more importantly, she began to see herself that way too. Camille was no longer the woman on the margins of history, the one neglected by her family, the one carrying the pain of abandonment. She was now at the center of the narrative, with a role that was not only important to national security but crucial to the country's future. She reflected on everything she had experienced. The pain of rejection, the emptiness of loneliness, the weight of invisibility, all of this was part of her journey. But now, as she looked to the future, she knew that every step she took had led her here, to the point where she could finally see herself as a strong, resilient, and indispensable woman. Accepting her new role was not an easy surrender. She had to let go of many things along the way, not only the identity forged by her family, but also her need for approval, her relentless pursuit of recognition from others. To finally accept who she was, Camille had to shed those layers of shame, fear, and insecurity that had plagued her for so long. She knew the role she now played was dangerous, complex, and often relentless. But what made her different from before was the deep understanding that she was making a difference, that her ability to reinvent herself, to hide, and to adapt had real value. The pain of being left behind by her family, the feeling of never being good enough to be seen, now became a silent motivation. Camille used rejection as fuel to be better, more effective, stronger. Each operation she completed, each mission she accomplished, made her understand more about herself and the role she was playing in the world. She was no longer trying to please anyone. She was doing what she did best, being invisible when necessary, being ruthless when required, and being a powerful ally to those who needed her. Looking to the future, Camille felt a sense of peace she had never imagined she would achieve. It wasn't a tranquil peace, like the kind one seeks in an open, empty field, but a peace forged through struggle, effort, and transformation. She knew her journey hadn't been easy, nor would it be. She knew the battles yet to come would demand even more of her courage and her ability to reinvent herself, but she also knew she was prepared. She had become who she needed to be, and nothing else could change her. The process of acceptance didn't mean she had abandoned everything she had been before. She had simply learned to use what she had experienced to become someone stronger, more independent, and freer. Camille was no longer on the margins of her own life. She had earned her place with dignity and unbeatability. She had become an essential figure, someone who would not be easily forgotten, either by the international forces she dealt with nor by the memory of the country she was helping to protect. She had become not only an essential part of a covert operation, but also an essential part of the world itself. Acceptance of her new role came not from without, but from within. Camille had finally accepted herself. She knew who she was, what it meant to be an invisible woman, and what it meant to be a woman of significance to the country. Now, with confidence built in the shadows, she walked into the future, stronger, more determined, and freer than she could ever have imagined. Camille now understood something that had previously seemed distant, intangible. True power doesn't come from being recognized, applauded, or accepted by others. True power comes from within. It comes from the courage to stand up, to move forward when everything around you tells you you're worthless. Power comes from the moment you decide, without hesitation, to rewrite your own story. She no longer needed her family's validation to feel like someone. She had already proven, silently and unstoppably, that she could be anything she wanted to be, without asking anyone's permission. Camille's journey was marked by pain, loss, and rejection. But in each of these moments, she discovered a strength no one could take from her, the ability to reinvent herself. She knew how to disappear when necessary, live in the shadows, and return with a strength few could imagine. She finally understood that the greatest obstacle she faced was not the world, but what she believed the world thought of her. When she freed herself from this, when she left behind the chains of an identity imposed by others, that was when she truly became who she was always meant to be. Today, Camille is a powerful woman, not because others recognize her, but because she recognized herself. She understood that her value lies not in the approval of others, but in the ability to follow her own path, to fight for her own ideals, to take control of her life and her story. Camille's reinvention was not just a change of name or role, but an internal transformation, a journey of self-sufficiency, where she now controls her own narrative. She no longer depends on anyone to be relevant, powerful, or, most importantly, happy. The power of reinvention is in our hands. It's up to us to find the courage to be who we truly are, regardless of the opinions of the world around us. Camille showed us that, no matter how much adversity knocks us down, we always have the power to get up and start over, to rebuild our lives based on what defines us, not what others say we are. If you also believe in the power of reinventing yourself, taking control of your own narrative and conquering your freedom, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of transformation and strength. Don't let fear or other people's expectations define your path. You have the power to create your own story. Let's join us on this journey.